Most pirates were driven to the sea by desperation, born into the gutters of London or the slums of Port Royal, with nothing to lose but their lives. Stede Bonnet was different. He was born into the lap of luxury, a wealthy landowner with a library full of books and a reputation as a refined gentleman. Yet he chose to trade his silk robes for a Jolly Roger, becoming the most unlikely and bizarre figure of the Golden Age of Piracy. This is the story of the gentleman pirate, a man who abandoned everything for a life he was entirely unqualified to lead. The story begins in the lush, sun-drenched plantations of Barbados in the late 17th century. Stede Bonnet was born in 1688 into a family of significant wealth and status. His father, Edward Bonnet, owned a sprawling estate that produced the white gold of the era, sugar. When his father died, Stede was only 6 years old, leaving him the heir to a massive fortune and a prestigious social standing.
He was educated as a gentleman, trained in the classics, and eventually became a major in the Barbados militia. By all accounts, he was a pillar of the community, a man who should have lived out his days in quiet, wealthy comfort.
He married Mary Allenby in 1709, and together they had children. They moved in the highest circles of colonial society, but beneath the surface of this perfect life, something was festering. Contemporary accounts from those who knew him in Barbados suggested that Bonnet's mind was disordered. Some historians speculate he suffered from what we would today call a midlife crisis, while others point to a breakdown in his marriage. There were rumors that the discomforts he found in a married state drove him to a state of near madness. Whatever the spark, in the spring of 1717, Stede Bonnet did something that shocked the Caribbean. He decided to become a pirate.
But Stede Bonnet didn't become a pirate the way everyone else did. He didn't lead a mutiny, and he didn't steal a ship from a harbor under the cover of darkness. Instead, he did the most gentlemanly thing possible. He bought one. He went to the shipyards, took out a portion of his fortune, and purchased a 6-gun sloop, which he named the Revenge.
He didn't stop there. He didn't know how to sail, let alone how to lead a crew of cutthroats, so he did what any businessman would do. He hired a crew of 70 experienced sailors and offered them a fixed contract with regular wages, a practice unheard of in the world of piracy, where men usually worked for a share of the loot. In the middle of the night, without a word to his wife or his peers, Major Stede Bonnet sailed out of Bridgetown. The gentleman pirate was born, though he was currently wearing a velvet morning gown and reading a book in his cabin while his hired crew handled the rigging.
The early days of Bonnet's career were a strange mix of accidental success and humiliating failure. He sailed north toward the American colonies, targeting merchant vessels off the coast of Virginia and New York. To the surprise of many, the Revenge managed to capture several prizes. Bonnet was a quick study in some ways, but he was no seaman. He famously allowed his crew to burn captured ships, even after they had been looted, an unnecessary act of destruction that drew unwanted attention from the authorities.
The turning point in Bonnet's life came when he sailed into the pirate haven of Nassau in the Bahamas. Nassau was a chaotic nest of thieves, governed by the Flying Gang. It was here that the polished, wealthy Bonnet met the most terrifying man on the Atlantic, Edward Teach, better known as Blackbeard. The pairing was absurd. Blackbeard was a giant of a man who twisted smoking fuses into his beard to look like a demon from hell. Bonnet was a gentleman who still preferred his books to his cutlass. Blackbeard immediately saw that Bonnet was out of his depth. He also saw a perfectly good ship and a crew that was already paid for. In a move that was both an insult and a calculated power play, Blackbeard invited Bonnet to stay aboard his own ship, the Queen Anne's Revenge, as a guest, while Blackbeard's first mate took command of Bonnet's ship. Essentially, Bonnet became a prisoner on his own vessel. While Blackbeard terrorized the coast, Bonnet was relegated to the sidelines, often seen pacing the deck in his dressing gown, still reading his library books while his men followed a real pirate captain. This period was a profound humiliation for Bonnet, but it also gave him a front row seat to the most legendary pirate campaign in history.
He was present for the famous blockade of Charleston, where Blackbeard held an entire city hostage for a chest of medicines. However, the partnership was destined to end in betrayal. After the blockade, Blackbeard decided he wanted to retire and take advantage of the king's pardon, a royal decree offering amnesty to pirates who surrendered.
He tricked Bonnet into going to North Carolina to secure his own pardon, promising to meet him later. While Bonnet was away, Blackbeard stripped the Revenge of its supplies, marooned most of Bonnet's original crew on a deserted sandbar, and vanished with all the treasure. When Bonnet returned and found his men starving and his ship empty, something snapped. The gentleman vanished, replaced by a man consumed by a singular burning desire: revenge. He rescued his marooned men and set out to find Blackbeard, but to avoid breaking the terms of his new pardon, he changed his name to Captain Thomas and renamed his ship the Royal James.
This new Bonnet was different. He was more aggressive, more desperate, and increasingly unstable. He began to command his men with a cruelty he hadn't shown before. He took several prizes in the waters off Delaware Bay and Cape Fear, but his luck was running thin. The authorities in South Carolina, embarrassed by the Blackbeard blockade, were in no mood for more pirates.
Governor Robert Johnson commissioned Colonel William Rhett to hunt down the outlaws infested in the Cape Fear River. In September 1718, the hunt came to a head. Colonel Rhett discovered Bonnet's ship tucked away in the river. What followed was one of the most grueling and bizarre battles in naval history.
Both the pirate ship and the pursuing vessels ran aground on the shifting sandbars of the river. For hours, the ships sat tilted in the mud, unable to maneuver, just a few hundred yards apart. The crews spent the entire day trading insults and musket fire across the water, waiting for the tide to rise and decide their fate.
Bonnet, showing a flash of the military training he had received in the Barbados militia, stood on the deck and threatened to blow up his own ship rather than surrender. He paced the tilted deck with a pistol in each hand, shouting defiance. But as the tide came in, it favored the hunters. Rhett's ships floated first.
Seeing the end was near, Bonnet's crew, who had no desire to die for a man they still viewed as an eccentric amateur, forced him to surrender. The trial of Stede Bonnet in Charleston was a sensation. It wasn't just a criminal proceeding, it was a cultural event.
The gentleman pirate was a paradox that the colonial mind couldn't quite grasp. How could a man of education and wealth choose such a path? While his crew was quickly tried and hanged, Bonnet's execution was delayed. He used this time to write desperate, piteous letters to the governor, begging for mercy.
He offered to have his limbs cut off if only his life were spared, promising to live in total seclusion and repentance. His letters divided the city. Many of the elite in Charleston felt a strange sympathy for him. He was, after all, one of them. But the presiding judge, Nicholas Trott, was unmoved.
Trott delivered a scathing, hours-long lecture on the spiritual consequences of piracy, reminding Bonnet that his education and wealth made his crimes even more heinous, not less. On December 10, 1718, Stede Bonnet was led to the gallows at White Point Garden. He was dressed in his fine clothes, clutching a small bouquet of flowers in his bound hands, a final, macabre gesture of his gentlemanly roots. He was hanged until dead, his body left to sway in the sea breeze as a warning to others.
The legacy of Stede Bonnet is one of the strangest footnotes in maritime history. He wasn't the most successful pirate, nor the most feared. He was a man who tried to escape the stifling expectations of his class and ended up losing his soul and his life in the process. He remains a mystery, a man who had everything and threw it away for a dream of freedom that he didn't understand.
He is remembered not for his conquests, but for the sheer, baffling absurdity of his existence. The gentleman pirate proved that the sea doesn't care about your birthright, your books, or your manners. It only cares for the strength of your will, and in the end, Stede Bonnet's will was as fragile as the silk he left behind. If you enjoyed this deep dive into history's most bizarre pirate, subscribe for more.